Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed. And this week, I'm excited to have Nick Fogle as a guest on the podcast. Nick is founder and CEO of ChurnKey. And Nick's got a proven track record in leveraging churn reduction strategies to enhance company value. He's had a acquisition under his belt that happened in January of 2021, which we're going to talk about. And now Nick's focus is primarily optimizing customer retention and company performance. And it's my understanding that, given your track record as a successful entrepreneur, you've got multiple acquisition offers and you've got, this favorable deal with Calm Capital. This is all the stuff that you can expect that we're going to talk about in this episode. But some of the things that we're going to talk about, lessons that he's learned going through the acquisition process and being acquired, successfully bootstrapping a business, launching a venture without financial backing, and maximizing the health of your subscription business. So, Nick, without further ado, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome, man. Yeah, so, I just gave a little bit of background on you, but I'd love to, hear it straight from you as well. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I guess if you start way back, I'm a recovering attorney. I did practice law for a bit and found my way into software because I just wasn't happy with the transactional law that I was doing. Actually, before that, I was finishing a degree in economics. 2008 happened. I was out at dinner with Bank of America, part of that new hiring class. And then the bottom fell out in the housing market. And you can imagine hiring freezes. So I said, well, you know what? I'll go to law school. Be a good way to kind of hunker down and wait it out. And it turned out that, that may not have been the best decision for me, although there's a lot of value in learning to think like a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, it really teed me up for like the next 10 years. But there was a lot of pain during that period of figuring out, well, I've got all the student loan debt, but I don't love what I'm doing. Yeah. So I spent a season kind of wandering through the wilderness after I stepped away from the transactional law firm I was with, figuring out like, what do I actually want to do? And I had this massive student loan debt. It had accrued to $250,000 just because I had a very high interest. It was still like the government backed loan, but it was like an 8% grad plus loan. And those were negative amortizing for years and years and years. And I think at the peak, it was like $50 in interest per day just to like make it not grow. And that context is important because I felt this tremendous pressure on my shoulders to get out of this debt, to pay it down. And I realized I was not going to be able to do this, at least with the law firm I was with. And it was like, I'm miserable doing this anyway. I'm not making as much to pay this loan down. Like, I need to own my own business. Like, it's like there are two different avenues you can really chase in life that have like uncapped salary. One is sales. The other is being an entrepreneur, which is also sales in a way. You just can't avoid that. So I taught myself to code. Nobody wanted to go work with me to build this idea that I had for this first startup. No matter how much equity I was willing to throw to a software engineer, they were just like, no, like you got to pay me something. So I said, okay, well, I'll learn to code. So I spent about 6 months to a year working on this idea. By working on the idea, I actually got pretty good at writing code and building apps. And while that idea was a total flop, it wasn't something that was market viable. I learned enough to get an internship at a software company here where I am, and turned that internship just, worked. I was the first one there, last one to leave, worked like crazy. That turned into a full-time job. I kind of progressed up the ladder at the corporate cubicle setting, was still working on side projects. And in 2016, I guess I'd been there about 3 years. We started, myself and my co-founder for Wave, the business that was acquired. We started a first version of the business. And as a lot of first-time entrepreneurs, you make a mistake of saying, hey, we'll build this amazing app or product. And when we do that, it's this app that we really want to build. People are just going to flock to us. And we thought we'd raise money. We do the whole like viral marketing thing. This was back when social apps were still the rage. And we built what was an early precursor to like Twitter Spaces or Clubhouse. 2016, way too early. And we worked for a long time, forever. And the amount of tech we built it was incredible what we built. We ended up selling to a few like radio shows, a few podcasters, but it just was not enough to build a sustainable business. I was still working a 9 to 5 during that time, trying to pay down these crazy student loans. And eventually we scrapped that and we said, this is not going to work out. But as kind of the last ditch Hail Mary effort before we just said, we give up, I was thinking, well, part of the problem with building this product is like getting the audience to us. And back in 2016, one problem you had on social media was that audio did not share well. Like you would upload an MP3 and you get just like the little MP3 track player that you play. There was no visual dynamic to it. Nobody clicked on audio post. And that was a big problem for podcasters and people. So I said, all right, well, I'll take the audio that we have with this community that has all this really great audio, and we will create this special waveform animation. It's a video, feed the audio in, create a video, and we'll use that to bootstrap our community. And it didn't really work to bootstrap the community. But what it did was suddenly we saw that there was a market for what we were building here, a tool for creators, specifically radio shows, podcasters, any creative that had audio content. They were saying, hey, I'm not really interested in your community, but can you make these for me? And we started thinking, okay, maybe there's something here. So initially we were charging like $7 and we were like manually creating these. It was like a monthly thing. It was not scalable at all. But once the demand reached a point, we were like, okay, we're onto something here. And that was the origin of the business. We rebranded, renamed it to Wave as like, a waveform. And that was the origin story of turning a failed startup into a pivot that ultimately had success. And it was enough success to exit as we innovated and listened to the market and continued to build a platform for creators.
So it sounds like the original community was built in 2016. When did the pivot happen?
Well, it was really 2015, I guess, when we first started building out those communities. By late 2016, we were at this point where it was just like, this is not working. We can't raise funding. I was working 80 hours a week, 9 to 5, and building this nights and weekends. And I was just tapped out. And my loans were still growing, and it was not a great scenario. I was burned out. And I was just, my founder and I were talking. It was like, this isn't working. Like, we've got to find some way to make this viable or close shop. So that was like August, September, October, kind of like Q3 of 2016.
Got it. So like a year and some change in, pretty much, you were like, all right, we've got to do something. We've got to change the model here. And at that point, when you guys were contemplating the pivot, you were getting those requests from creators to, kind of create.
Yeah.
So explain to me, just for clarity purposes, is it, was what they were asking you to create was like some sort of visual graphic of some sort for the audio?
Yeah. So you've seen these. It's called the Audiogram. We were the first ones to commercialize this idea of an audiogram. So you upload an audio file, and we created like 10 or 12 of these different animations that you could use for this. So, it could be like, there were some really engaging ones out there that would be animated according to the audio that you're listening to. And initially, it was very basic. It was just like your podcast album art, your artwork as a background. And then over time, we like added in captioning. So like, subtitles, as well as animations around the it just expanded to be more of a video platform over time. But yeah, to your point, when it started, it was a kind of a trickle of people on social that saw these and they would respond. And we started adding waveform, like a watermark to the waveform. So this little wave watermark would pop up. And that was when we really started to see the traction take off, because people would see that if you were on the free tier of Wave, you would see, you would have to have the watermark. If you wanted to remove it, you'd have to pay. But I was very gun shy. So like after going, spending 12 to 18 months on something that never took off, I was like very skeptical. Like, this is not going to be a long-term business. But if you think back to 2016, 2017, podcasting was still not quite mainstream yet. Most people didn't really know what a podcast was. And it was part of my thesis around building startups is, if you're in a market long enough and you listen to people, you listen to customers, you become much more in tune with the problems and the pain points that need to be solved. And the core problem that we started to identify was that audio doesn't share well. And there's a large growing market of audio creators that need a way to share their content because they want to build their brand and they want to grow their audience as well.
And so I hear that you were gun shy, at first when you started getting these requests, but really what helped the company take off was that watermark, essentially. Like, when did you move from being gun shy to like, oh my God, this is actually like, this is going to work? Like,
I blame law school and making me a pessimist, which is weird to be an entrepreneur who has some natural pessimism there. But I was pessimistic for probably the first year after that, where I was just very stingy with my time and what I would build. I think that was really valuable to making sure we built the right thing. So while I was initially very conservative, we started to feel just tremendous market pull to solve this problem. And for the first 5 or 6 months, I was just building out the infrastructure to like create the video. There was no way to like build this online. People would send us their artwork. They would pick out a design. They would put down their card. And my co-founder would actually make these. He would like go in Canva and like design these. It's like Paul Graham saying of doing things that don't scale.
Don't scale. That's right. Yeah.
Did not
that
scale at all.
That definitely was not scalable.
And $7 a month, I think, is what we were charging initially. And looking back, I think the turning point for me, let's fast forward, we started working on this pivot in like October of 2016. In April of 2017, my co-founder, he left and went to Greece with his wife for a week. And I was suddenly the one that had to build these things. And I said, oh my gosh, this is such a tremendous effort. Like when we were getting like 4 or 5 customers coming to us a day, there were new customers. Again, that's $35 a month. If it's 5 customers, $7. And I'm spending 2 hours building these things out. So I'm like, we've got to have some way to, make this online or where people can self-serve and do this. So I just went heads down for a month and cranked out like a basic app that somebody could use to build their own. And that was when we really took off. The watermark actually came around that same time frame, a few months after actually. So you could self-serve. And then we had this free tier where people could come on, they could only use, a certain amount of minutes, audio to video minutes per month. And once they exceeded that, they would need to upgrade. And that was like a really great growth strategy because with this viral component that would drive free inbounds, and we get podcasters who had all these great sound bites from a podcast. And there were only a few minutes you'd get for free each month. So it made sense to do that. And then we realized that there are multiple pricing plans. Some podcasters do a lot of recordings. They might do a daily podcast and they would be on like the top tier plan that was a lot more expensive. So that was part of that growth story. And that was the real key inflection point there too, is being forced to realize the pain that my co-founder was facing to build these, realizing the market demand was sufficient now to actually build out self-serve. So we were really pulled into solving this problem. Yeah,
it's interesting kind of the look back, connecting the dots. Are you still a pessimist or no?
Yeah. Okay, cool. I don't think that's something we really change. I tend to be a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist. And that like I'm acutely aware of risks and what can happen. And with podcasting, I was like, well, podcasts could just stop, or like Facebook or Google or somebody could build a similar tool, or like our SEO, which was like our bread and butter of growth. Maybe Google like redoes the algorithm. So there are all these like risks that can undermine a business. But as an entrepreneur, you're constantly thinking about that and being aware of that, holding that in your mind and knowing it could happen, but knowing that long-term, there's always a way to address that. You can always overcome that by being resilient. Kind of what makes a startup successful is that resilience and sticking with something long enough.
So what's it like being an entrepreneur who built this product, who at the beginning of the journey kind of, was pessimistic about it, and then when you were forced to step into the shoes of your co-founder, recognize how much effort had to be put in. So as a result, you solve that problem by creating this tool and then watch the platform take off. It's really interesting. I see entrepreneurs that fall into a couple different camps, specifically in the acquisition space, right? So some entrepreneurs go into, being a startup founder and they're like, when I hit the $100 million, inflection point, I'm going to sell the business, for example. Other entrepreneurs are like, I'm never going to sell the business, and then within that, there's this concept of like an exit number, like make sure that you have your exit number so that when you hit that number, that you've kind of got to the place that you wanted to get to. And, that's a kind of turning point threshold that you can acknowledge, like, I want to continue building the business, or, I've gone as far as I wanted to go, and now I'm ready to pass the baton and the torch to someone else. I recognize that, and I'm self-aware enough to know that I can only take the business to this level, and I can't, and I don't want to, I don't like to take it beyond this level. So what's it like as an entrepreneur who watched this business kind of go from this thing that wasn't working to all of a sudden working? And then in 2021, so only, a few short years later, all of a sudden you got acquired. What was that like?
Yeah, it was number one, I'll say it's nice to have a co-founder to be able to balance these perspectives and having a nice tension there between thinking out long-term, having discussions around, well, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario for the business? And we tended to constantly exceed my conservative model. And eventually, most startups, once you reach a certain scale, and I don't know what the platforms are that buyers use to scope out potential acquisition targets. But we started to get inbound after like a year. So maybe late 2017, early 2018, people were aware of us. So buyers were aware of us. We started to get inbounds from people saying, hey, we'd love to talk to you about buying Wave. And I think we were maybe doing like $200,000 a year at that point.
Still not much.
And not much, annual recurring revenue. And we had a conversation with Spotify. This was when Spotify was going like acquisition crazy. They had just acquired a number like Gimlet Media and what was I think it was called Anchor was another like
Anchor
app.
FM, yeah.
Yeah. So then they wanted to meet with Little Wave. They didn't know what our numbers were like. And I think during that conversation, we were like, whoa, like Spotify is talking to us about an acquisition deal. Big company like that is not going to acquire a company doing that little revenue. Just the numbers wouldn't make sense, like the valuation, unless you had some crazy strategic value. But that got us thinking about, okay, like maybe there is a path to an acquisition. We were looking at it as a lifestyle business at that time, where eventually, it's like, okay, well, we can pay an income. We can pay ourselves a decent income, like profits from the business. Our margins were like 85%. It was a very high margin business. 3 months after Spotify, we get another acquisition offer. And this one was much more compelling because it was like an individual. They were represented by a broker. They came to us and they said, hey, we represent someone who's really interested in the space. They're interested in what you're building. And it was like 4 to 5x of our ARR at that point, which is like a decent multiple, I guess. And it was a very hard decision for me because at this point I still had like $150,000 in student loans outstanding. And I was doing the numbers and it's like, okay, you start thinking about, what if something happened to this business tomorrow? Like suddenly there's a dollar sign associated with the business. This is way more than my net worth, which was negative at the time. Like I was like, okay, I could catch up on retirement. I can pay back these student loans. And this is where the co-founder is helpful to give you some tension. It's like, Nick, we have grown, 12% per month over the last couple months, or it was higher than that at that point. Why would we think that would stop anytime soon? Why would we settle for this multiple? And I think it's helpful to have that kind of reframing and be able to challenge those assumptions. If I'd been solo, I may have taken the money and run. I think that it would have been a different calculus in my mind. But that's where that tension and the balance can help by getting feedback at that time. So it was very difficult. But I'll tell you what, when you say no to that much money, suddenly you know what your business is worth and you become much more aggressive in continuing to ensure you're doing the things that it needed to grow.
It's validating. It's very validating.
It was so validating. Yeah. We invested so much time in it. And it was like, the thought I had was, okay, well, we can sell this business eventually. There's a lot that we can do in the meantime to increase the value multiples. So I started learning a lot about value multiples, SDE versus EBIT type of multiples. We started meeting with our own broker. So we were like, okay, well, if we're going to do this, let's meet with a business broker and start figuring this out, see what we could potentially get. And we check in with a broker maybe every 6 months from then until almost the point where we were acquired. If we fast forward to 2020, we were doing end of 2019, early 2020, we were doing about $70K a month. So it was like maybe 800 to 900 a year. And then COVID happened. And suddenly I was, in a panic, what's going to happen? But the creative economy took off. So that became a nice tailwind for the business. And that's when we started meeting with business brokers because we knew like we were not the best people to run this business. We weren't podcasters. We loved the problem, but we'd been in this problem space for 5 years working with audio creators. And we were kind of ready to move on to new things. I was also still doing the 9-to-5 job at that time. So it was just, I was so tired and I was just like, this represents so much of our net worth at this point. It would make sense to get a win and then maybe slow down a little bit, have a better quality of life. I just had my first son at that point. So there was just a lot of lifestyle changes that made it where it seemed like a better decision. But here was the issue. So early 2021, we met with a broker and we were really aiming for like 5 to 6 times value multiple, looking at SDE. But we had really high churn. Our churn, and this is pretty common with like prosumer SaaS apps, same thing with like B2C SaaS apps, you've got very high monthly churn. And our monthly churn was like 13 to 15%, which it basically meant that we had to replace our entire group of paying customers every 6 to 9 months. Like everybody that's out there today, we got all this revenue, but we got to replace all of them in 6 to 9 months. So that was extremely stressful. And it was also very painful from like a valuation point of view, because at that level, I think our SDE multiple would have only been like 3 or something. So as we were talking to the business broker, he was like, I know what you're saying you want for the business. Let me just tell you, like, this is what the market is looking at. And churn is a massive part of this. So I said, okay, let's work on our churn. So my co-founder and I rolled up our sleeves. We spent a fortune on churn consultants, which is a thing, but it didn't really move the needle. We used a number of like products that were out there that could help, and they helped a little bit, but we noticed there were a lot of customers that used the product periodically. So they would use the product for a few months, then they would want to, cancel the subscription, then they'd come back again. And I was like, okay, well, why don't we give these customers an opportunity to pause? Let's have a survey when they leave, understand the churn intent, like why are they leaving? Also during COVID, price sensitivity was a big deal. Even though our plans were still low, we'd increase them, but it was like $15 to $30 a month. But during COVID, people were cash strapped and worried. So being able to offer them, if they cited budget as a reason for canceling, like before they cancel, offer them something to stay. So we spent a year really fine tuning our cancellation flow and like voluntary churn, reducing that. We spent a ton of time too working on failed payment recovery, ensuring that our failed payments were being recovered at a high rate. And by focusing on those and just zeroing in on that problem, it was like 6 to 9 months before we saw like the tremendous result that ended up with a much higher valuation. But we got our churn rate from like 13 to 15% down to about 8% consistently, which is massive. And that got us back to that. It basically doubled our valuation. And the other benefit of that, valuation aside, our growth skyrocketed because suddenly we weren't losing nearly as many people a month. We were losing barely half of what we were losing previously. So we grew that business to, over that next year, we doubled again to about $140,000 a month in recurring revenue. Yeah. So final thing I'll say about that the journey is we had every intention of using a broker, our same broker that we'd been working with. And the plan was, okay, in Q1, we're going to re-engage the broker. Business is looking really good. Other footnote here, by the way, by this point, the business felt so healthy. It was like, we almost didn't want to sell it. I think that's a decent truism, is a really great business is one you don't want to sell. But that aside, we were still burned out. I had left my 9-to-5 job at that point, and I feel like together, our team had done just about everything we could to optimize the value. And it was like, it's time for a new owner to kind of take the next steps with this business. As painful as that was, because the business was doing really well. But back to the broker, we were thinking we'd go to the broker in Q1, they'd get us to the market and we'd have a bidding war or something. But the wildest thing happened in November. Within a period of a few days, we had 5 different potential acquirers reach out to us. I suspect it's because in 2020, all that money was on the sidelines, and suddenly you had people that had capital that in the year they needed to find a place for that capital. Christmas Eve, or the day before Christmas Eve, those 5 different potential acquirers had matured into 3 letters of intent. We got them all the same day before Christmas Eve in 2020.
What a Christmas gift.
And that was, yes, it was. It was so exciting to actually have these and be able to go into the holidays and review them. And we met with everybody. We looked at the dollar value. And we also looked at, we loved this business. We'd spent the last 5 or so years of our life working on it. We had like 100-something thousand users, 20 or like 15,000 paying customers. And we wanted to find a good home for it. We didn't want to just go for the highest value, that's going to strip it for parts or drive it into the ground. So we found like the best mix possible with Calm Capital, who was the acquirer we ended up going with. We agreed to the letter of intent. And then fast forward to March of 2021, we actually said, all right, well, like that's going to be our closing date. We all worked toward it. We actually didn't need the broker. If I hadn't had legal experience and a network of attorneys here, I would have definitely wanted to use a broker. But it worked out that we were able to navigate most of that ourselves with some assistance from outside counsel.
And well, also it's kind of interesting thinking about the fact that had you all been thinking about churn, so you had been meeting with the broker, you checked in every 6 months, you got that first acquisition offer that validated your experience about a year into the growth of the business, and you were like, okay, cool, we got this relatively somewhat viable offer. There was like a threshold point there where you were like, oh man, should we take this? And then that validated like, okay, we can actually really do this. Let's actually keep the exit in mind as we build this business. And let's build it kind of in coordination with keeping the exit in mind, having the broker, at top of mind. And the broker was the one that pointed out like, hey, your churn is really high. Had you been thinking about how high your churn was before the broker pointed it out, or?
No. Yeah, it was painful because it was like, oh, we're losing this many customers a month. But I think a lot of founders make this mistake where when you're growing really fast, you're not really paying attention to churn. But being pessimistic like I am, I started looking out, okay, well, if our churn stays at this rate, like there's going to be a growth ceiling that we reach, and we can't get past that because eventually the number of new users is going to flatten out. And it wasn't until meeting with the broker that I realized to what extent that not only impacted our day-to-day business in terms of our growth, but also, our valuation is sliced in half by not having this. And I think a lot of founders it's a painful thing. Every churn event is, if you watch your churn from, whatever reporting tool you use, it's painful. It's more fun to focus on growth. And I think that was the problem space that we really dug into. And that's why we built a new platform to solve retention for customers, is because nobody wants to think about churn. Why don't we have a platform that is in your corner? It's focused on churn. You can log in however often you want to and check out your numbers, but you're going to be saving between 30 and 40% of these customers that are leaving. Like, they're not going to, 30 to 40% of them are not actually going to leave. You're going to keep them long term. So that was the origin story of Turnkey. And it goes back to that thought of, if you stay in a market long enough and you identify points that are painful. Previously, it had been audio creators and realizing audio didn't share well. And through the process of building Wave, it was that, churn is a really hard problem to solve. Most founders and teams kind of ignore it. They don't give it the focus it deserves. And it's this really painful problem where there's a lack of tools to address it. So that was the origin story of Turnkey, right at the end of Wave's story. And it worked out nicely too, to be able to have an exit and an idea in mind of what we would do next.
How long after you sold Wave did you start building Turnkey?
Oh man, there was overlap there where
I thought you wanted a break, Nick.
I know. We should have a therapy session separate to this. And sometimes I'm like, man, I should have taken more of a break. I think there's something to be said for work cadence. And once you get used to working an insane number of hours, it's hard to pull back. So that fall, we had these tools that were working really well. And we started work on breaking that out and creating a dedicated product called ChurnKey. And it was a lot of work to do that. It was these projects are always a bigger lift than you anticipate. And when we sold ChurnKey, we launched publicly that same month. So there was no break. It was basically,
you mean when you sold Wave, you launched?
Oh, yes. When we sold Wave, we launched ChurnKey
the same month. Yeah. I was like, whoa, you sold ChurnKey already too? Okay, wow.
And they bought it back or something? No. The timing, it's confusing because it was such a tight timeline. When I look back, I'm like, what was I thinking? But having that momentum is nice because you're used to working so hard, and it's like, well, let's just go to the next thing. And that was 3.5 years ago. We launched a private beta too before the Wave deal was even closed out. But
you were
we're lucky it all worked out.
You were the exemplification of product market fit for your own product, right? So
yes,
you had gone through I think once a founder goes through the experience of identifying product market fit, especially if it's a tough PMF journey of hitting the wall and being like, man, this isn't working, and having to pivot, and then getting in that sweet spot of product market fit. Once you've been through that, I think that really sets up entrepreneurs, in their journey moving forward to know how to find it easier moving forward. I think
you're 100% correct. The funny thing though, as a second time founder, is we just sold this company. It was a mid 7-figure deal. We were doing 140 or 150K a month in revenue when we left. And then starting from zero was a little bit humbling. But when we went into that, it was we'll just repeat the same in a year or so. I'm thinking that we could just rinse and repeat. But going from B2C to B2B was just fish out of water, totally different. And we actually did not have product market fit when we started because we were looking for customers that were just like us. And I realized we were an anomaly because a lot of small teams, it's a psychological issue. They don't want to. They're very opinionated. They're not as, it's more of a lifestyle thing. They're not as analytical with numbers. And at that time too, we were early to the space. So there were we would share it and they're like, okay, that's cool. I'm growing so fast. It's not an issue now. But the tailwind for ChurnKey was suddenly the economy softened. Churn numbers for all subscription businesses started to spike. And then we started to get inbounds. Yep. So we started to get more inbounds. And to the point of product market fit, it was a clear moment where we started to feel the pull. And it was less we were having to push this in the market and just bug people on Twitter to say, hey, take a look at this tool. Suddenly people were coming to us and they said, hey, my name is Tom and I've got a churn problem. Can you help me? Which is it's a beautiful thing. And now we've been at it for 3.5 years, and we're saving millions and millions of dollars a month for businesses that integrate with us.
I definitely want to touch on Turnkey, but I'd love to dig into the acquisition a little more if you're open to that.
Yeah, let's do it.
You're doing, so just to get it out of the way, what was like the range of what the business sold for?
It's mid-7 figures. You can kind of do the math at home. There was like a Earnout type of deal as part of it. So the total value, it's the Earnout and everything's done now, but it was like I'd say 4 to 6x range on SDE. Cool. And our SDE was strong because our margins were like 90% or something.
Yeah. And so you got these 3 LOIs, Christmas Eve. How did you choose the right buyer? So I heard that one of the considerations, obviously, the numbers got to make sense, right? But was it ultimately the numbers that won, or what was kind of the deciding factor of how you chose the acquirer?
There was one like small private equity outfit that was interested. They were definitely the highest. It was the highest offer, but it did not feel like they were going to manage the business in a way that we wanted. There were 2 that we liked, and we felt like the business would land at a good home with either one of those acquirers. The business would land well. And then that was kind of a price discussion, thinking through the mix of upfront cash and how long that would last. Ultimately, we chose the one that seemed to have higher upside initially with upfront cash, because I was at a point where, hey, we're starting a new business. I'm ready to be mostly done with this one. So I would prefer to just go ahead and capture what I can up front, and then have, some kind of earnout based on performance after the fact.
How did you structure the earnout? What did the earnout structure look like?
It was based on company revenue targets, but there was a floor. And I liked that, so that, in a way, I guess you could think of it as seller financing, I don't know, or like installment, more of like an installment plan, where the floor would be a certain level of installments. And then if they exceeded the revenue targets for that quarter, then there would be upside to that.
Yeah.
And that seemed like a pretty low risk way of doing it.
I had another guest on the show that structured it as percentage of top line, which I also really loved.
Yeah, that's the key consideration I would have there is, once you sell the business, you don't have much control over the costs. So top line was what we used too, is because if you're not using that, somebody could just throw everything they had at it and you have no profit. And if they're doing percentage of profits, then you end up with nothing.
Yeah. So for all the listeners out there, if you're thinking about selling your business, definitely use top line as your metric for your earnouts. So cool. So there was an earnout. How long did you have to stay in the business?
Well, I think there was a 90-day period where we were obliged to help if things came up. And there was a certain number of hours from I was the CTO of this business. So I did most of the engineering work, and I had another engineer, and we committed to a certain number of hours to onboard their engineering team. But it was very well defined and clearly articulated in the purchase agreement of what that would look like. But yeah, it was like a 90-day period though. And at that point, we already had the cash in the bank, but it was just that transition period that was covered there.
Gotcha. So, okay, you're a transactional attorney. So the transaction itself probably wasn't anything new for you. But having been on the other side of the transaction in terms of being on the founder side, what are maybe 1 or 2 things that you learned from the experience?
It's not, so for us, we signed the LOI, it's first week of January, and everybody was ready for this transaction to happen. It was let's make this thing happen tomorrow. But there are so many bumps in the road that come up through due diligence. Regardless of how much people want the deal to happen, there are going to be bumps in the road. And there were moments during that 90-day period where I was maybe this deal won't happen. Maybe the terms or, what we're working through here is not going to resolve. So it was stressful. It was very stressful to not gravitate too much to this cash state. Oh yeah, this cash is basically already in the bank, thinking too far ahead. I think that would be one area to be cautious on, is just knowing that there are going to be bumps in the road. Don't get the dollar signs in your eyes and start thinking yeah, this cash is done. It's a done deal. What was it? Was it the Figma Adobe deal that just fell apart after everybody was waiting, a year of due diligence for that? But the good news is we had a very clear end date of it has to be done by X date. So we knew that there's not going to be this forever period. And we ended up closing on that date because there was just so much that had to happen between lenders and due diligence. And you can imagine there's just a lot of moving parts that you don't anticipate having when you've been running the business. A lot of it's in your head. You don't have a ton of the processes to cleanly hand this thing off. So there were just a lot of delays that ended up taking us to that final deadline.
Can you talk to me about a few of the bumps, like maybe 1 or 2 bumps?
Yeah, I think and this was years ago now, it seems like just yesterday, but fine details escape me. One detail was around the actual earnout provision, like how the earnout would work. We ended up needing to renegotiate that midway through. And I can't recall exactly why. I think we had different expectations around the handoff and, some of those, how the business would operate going forward and the entities and how it would be structured, rather than continuing to, it was an IP sale, right? So there were some challenges with like how the new entity would own those assets and things. And then the earnouts that were relevant or relative to that could be impacted. So we had to like renegotiate and go back through a bunch of like critical deal terms at that point. And there was a good week there where I was like, man, maybe this deal won't happen because the buyer's attorneys were not too keen on changing anything at that point. That was one detail. Another one was just realizing how much engineering effort we were going to have to put forth to be ready and poised to hand this off. We waited too late to start thinking through that. It was probably end of January. And we were like, we've got 60 days to have this thing teed up and ready to just pass the keys over. How are we going to hit that? So there was a lot of engineering work we had to do to ready it for a new owner.
Talk to me about, the technical side. Did they do like tech DD? Did they go in, evaluate like your tech debt, your code, all of your kind of SOPs around, code-based knowledge, that sort of stuff? What was that process of the tech handoff? What did that look like?
They did due diligence initially, and it was pretty light because our code base was, it was relatively clean. Like we had just refactored everything and modernized a lot of our code, and that was just kind of by accident. It wasn't it wasn't because of the transaction itself. So that helped. If we hadn't addressed the tech debt, I think the deal would have got delayed. There were like 5 different code bases though that ran different jobs or things for what we did. And video rendering, like what Wave does, it's gotten easier since then. But back when we started, it was just a totally new type of technology. So there was a lot of like old code that had to be migrated. We had to hand over like AWS accounts. It's funny, the AWS doesn't let you, my AWS account for Wave was tied to my personal Amazon.com account. You can't separate those two. At least if you had an account that was so old, you couldn't. So I'd like back since like 2001, I had this Amazon.com account with all my purchase history, all my recommendations, my Prime, all of that. And I had to hand that off, basically give my personal one away at closing. So there are so many of these long tail issues that pop up around that. I think it's good if you're considering a business sale to start jotting all of that down and making sure you've got really great documentation. In fact, we were writing documentation for some of those code bases during that 60-day period because we'd all been working with it for years. We didn't need documentation. Small team. But even if you're a small team and you know your code base really well, if you're ever thinking about selling that, you should go ahead and do it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Any other kind of last thoughts on the handoff? I hear that, there was a big push in that 60 days. Did you pretty much cover everything that you had to do in that 60-day push?
Yeah, there was also some complexity around like how much money we left in the bank account to cover, a monthly expense. Like some of these finer details, this is where it'd be helpful to have, a broker or counsel to walk you through it, or an accountant, because these were terms that, if I'd seen it, it had been a decade earlier when I was in the legal field and it was new to me. So I had to do a lot of outside consultation and just trying to figure out, well, what does that exact cash balance need to be? So I think that would be my recommendation, is try to use a broker or an expert to help you navigate the sale process, because they're going to be very familiar with all these terms and ensure that the deal doesn't get blown up at the last minute. Or at minimum, make sure you're consulting with experts in each of the different fields, starting in like that due diligence phase, to make sure you've got everything tightened up.
Yeah. So that was like the working capital allocations.
Yeah, working capital. That's
right. Yeah, that's usually a big pain in the ass and is usually pushed to the end of the deal.
It was like the last week, and we were like, their counsel was like, this doesn't match what we were expecting. How are my numbers not working here? And it was maybe a few $1,000s off. And ultimately, I think we were just like, yeah,
you can have it.
Let's tee it up.
Cool. Anything else you want to? I think we can close the chapter on the acquisition, unless there's anything else that you want to add.
Yeah, no, I think that the only thing I would say is it is weird working on something for so long and investing so much of your heart and soul into it, and then within like, a blink, it's somebody else owns it and controls it. That was a hard mental gap. I wouldn't say I was like depressed or anything. I know some people go through that, but maybe I would have been if we didn't have something else to work on. It was like we already knew we were building this other product and eager to launch something new to market. So there was a little bit of sadness in giving up this great business that we'd worked so hard to build. But then it's like, let's do it again because, this is a fun process.
Glutton for punishment.
Yeah. It's kind of like we were talking before you started recording about having kids, and just like it's rewarding, but it is exhausting. And I think your mind does something where you have this selective memory around those hard times. And with Wave, it was really easy once we got to that point of exiting to forget all of the struggle and hard times. It was basically like 3 years of pure pain and then like 1.5 years of fun, and then starting something new and thinking you're just going to pick right up at the fun part because you've done it before. And that's not true.
Yeah. I think the excitement of a new venture like carries a person into that venture, and then, the messy middle, right? So that's where kind of things get hard, and that middle part can be longer for some, shorter for others. But yeah, I feel like the excitement of a new venture is usually what propels an entrepreneur, to kind of that momentum is just like, all right, the wind carries you into it.
Yeah, it definitely did. Otherwise, and I'm telling everybody, they're saying like, what are you going to do after Turnkey? And I'm like, this is the last business I'm going to do. It's maybe in 10 years I'll be on something else.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Turnkey. So it's a churn reduction. How does it work?
Yeah, we're a retention platform for subscription businesses, and we handle every type of retention for you. So like voluntary churn, that's when somebody clicks that cancel button or messages your support team and tries to say, hey, can you cancel my subscription? And then there's accidental churn or involuntary churn, which is failed payments, which has become a really big problem in the last few years due to like fraud and other changes to the payments industry. So we recover those payments at a very high rate. We also run some other things around like customer health. Like we have a churn prediction product, which helps you understand how much of your revenue is at risk in any given month. And we also run something that is similar. It's not like pure retention, but it's around win backs. So when customers do churn, we have all this great data about the customer because they went through the turnkey cancel flow at some point. We can tee up a targeted win back campaign. So if somebody was saying they wanted to pause, they were saying, I'm not using this product enough, or I don't need it right now, teeing up a win back campaign to email them, message them, and entice them with a discount or some kind of offer to come back at a period of time. So that's the fourth prong or fourth sub product within the Turnkey platform.
Got it. And so for let's walk through those like 4 scenarios. So for the first one, how does Turnkey address those like straight cancellations?
So somebody clicks that dreaded cancel button. Well, a lot of most businesses still are not doing anything. You click the button, your subscription's over. And what we found is that not everybody who clicks that button actually wants to cancel. There's a reason why they're canceling, and it may be possible to counteract that churn intent with the right type of offer to keep them. So based on that, there's an initial survey that we trigger that can come up. And this is really about facilitating a better relationship between subscribers and businesses. So if you think about it, you've got a customer who might be leaving because they're not using something enough. They might be on a plan that's too expensive. They might have a temporary budget need. There are a number of different reasons why someone would cancel. We use AI and a number of things to look at the different offers that would be more likely to retain them. So obviously during COVID with Wave, we learned that if somebody cited budget, it's probably temporary. Let's give them a 50% discount for 3 months. Wave, we saw that had an overwhelming likelihood to keep them as a customer. It's much better for the customer. They still get to use your product, and it's better for you as a business because you're still bringing in some of that money and you're keeping the customer long term. So everybody wins in that scenario. Without Turnkey or without this flow in place, they would just leave. Both parties would leave and go their separate ways. So you miss out on the benefit of them getting value, and as a business, you also getting value.
So is the product like it plugs into the website API or something and like triggers a pop-up when someone hits the cancellation button?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very quick integration. We integrate directly with billing providers. So like Stripe, Paddle, ChargeBee, Braintree, those different payment processors and providers. You just click a button, you're integrated, and then you install a simple line of code, and that will trigger the Turnkey offboarding experience.
Very cool. Okay. And for the cancellation, I heard that, you also leverage AI to, essentially do an analysis of the offers, that have most effectively addressed churn? And so I would imagine there are various different kinds of offers based on, what the AI is analyzing.
Yeah, and a lot of it is still very rule-based, so you can define the different offers you're comfortable giving, and we can help you with our industry benchmarks to fine-tune that. So you're not giving up too much. If you're offering them something, you're not giving up, too much of a discount. You're not giving them a very long pause window. It's just enough to counteract that churn intent. Customer's still happy. You're obviously still happy as a business. AI comes into play in a few different areas. You have the opportunity to collect free-form feedback as a business from the customer. We run that through our NLP system, and we can pick up on other trends too. So it's not just churn specifically that we're able to help with, product feedback. So we have some businesses that they have like 30 to 40,000 cancellations per month. And if you can imagine, how on earth would you be able to understand why people are leaving if you didn't have a product like Turnkey in place? You're not able to track the trends. You're not able to track how things are changing over time. What are some of the different reasons? And are you suddenly releasing a buggy update and everybody's saying it's a technical issue? So we have a number of different features that give you a lot more intelligence as a business to understand what do your customers want, why are they leaving, and then what can you do to get ahead of churn.
So one of the things that I heard you say, during our interview is churn is something that a lot of businesses don't want to look at. And for you started to look at churn when you were starting to contemplate exiting the business, and the broker was like, hey, you probably want to take a look at churn because your churn's like incredibly high. So when do people come find you?
It's usually at that point where they're not necessarily an acquisition, but it's at the point where churn is 30% a month or 20% a month. And they wait a long time and they realize that they're no longer growing as fast. It's frustrating for me because initially we were having these conversations and people were just so focused on growth. It's like, it's important to reframe that and say reducing churn is growth. You grow faster when your churn rate is lower. Even if it's 0.1% lower, you're going to grow much faster. It's just the way SaaS works because it's that,
you're not losing, you're not bleeding out while you're trying to grow. You're keeping what you got and you're able to grow on top of that.
Exactly. It is the easiest lever to grow your business faster. It is the easiest thing. I mean, I had a call with somebody one time. His churn was a big problem. He was technical. We were on a sales demo. He was looking off the screen, between different monitors. I was like, yeah, this guy's never going to be interested. And at the end of the call, I'm just asking him what were your thoughts? Are we missing the mark here somewhere? He said, no, this was great. I'm sorry if I wasn't paying attention. I was just installing Turnkey. He had installed the product during the sales demo, and that business has saved hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Very cool.
Since then. So it is probably the lowest effort you can make to have a huge impact on your business. And then the bigger point too is if you were going to sell your business, if you're looking out 3 months, 6 months, a year out, you will have a massive impact on your value multiple just by reducing your churn number.
Awesome, man. This has been a great conversation. So to kind of round out this very windy conversation that has gone, and examined every part of your entrepreneurial journey pretty much, which I appreciate you sharing. I always love hearing, the stories from entrepreneurs here. And I know that the audience will get a lot of value from it as well, a lot of learning points. So to kind of just bring things to a wrap, what should people know about using Turnkey or churn or any other kind of feedback or advice that you might have for founders out there?
Yeah, maybe tie all this up pretty neatly here because I think a lot of my journey has taught me that it is so important to listen to the market and to listen to your customers. And that was the grounds by not doing that, we spent 18 months wandering in the wilderness with that first business that never panned out. But as soon as we listened to the market and started really getting in tune with the problem space, we were able to address that with a product that, was able to grow and ultimately exit. Turnkey was the same way by focusing on this pain point, understanding why, people are leading wave. We were able to build Turnkey. And I think for any business, it's extremely valuable to speak to your customers often. And at minimum, when they're leaving, you have to be able to have something in place to track why are they leaving. Because you can't change anything if you're just thinking that, well, they're gone. They click the cancel button, they're gone. There's nothing I can do. At minimum, you should be gathering that information so you can build a better product experience for your existing customers. But then with a tool like Turnkey, you're able to actually not only collect that data, but you're able to keep some of those customers. You have happier customers and you're happier running your business because your churn rate's lower.
Makes sense. Yeah. And that's great advice. Very much in tune with everything I've heard so far on the episode so far. And Nick, it's been a real pleasure chatting and hearing your story. And for all the listeners out there, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, hit like, leave us comments. What did you get from today's episode? What was your biggest takeaway? What was it that you found most helpful? Even if you hate today's episode, tell us about that too. That's fine. I'd love to, hear from the listeners out there. And Nick's contact information will be in the description of the episode. So I'll, put his LinkedIn and also the website for Turnkey. So if you want to reach out to Nick, you'll be able to reach him that way. And with that, Nick, thanks so much for joining this week, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Cool. And for all the listeners out there, thanks for listening to SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed, and I'll see you next week.